those warrants have not been served, have not been enforced. So what you have are people who are either detained or charged, and all of them except Rodrigo Duterte are Arabs or Africans. On the other hand, many of those cases were referred by the countries and ruling governments.
Taking center stage today is Ruben Carranza, a legal expert at the International Center for Transitional Justice. He spent decades helping victims of corruption and state violence seek reparations. In his home country of the Philippines, he headed the Commission on Good Government, which successfully retrieved $680 million of public money that disappeared during former President Ferdinand Marcos's rule. Carranza has documented extrajudicial killings during the reign of former President Rodrigo Duterte, who stands now charged with murder at the International Criminal Court. Ruben Carranza, welcome to Center Stage.
Thank you for having me here.
Rodrigo Duterte came to power with a promise to fight against drugs in the Philippines. He now stands accused of murder at the ICC. Why is that?
Because his war on drugs was really a war on the poor, and his so-called war on drugs was less about fighting drug dealing and crimes associated with that, as much as to find blame, to scapegoat people, those he named drug addicts, without due process, without any kind of prosecution, trial, punishment. And the idea was that he would portray himself as a savior. The Filipinos now have a large middle class, and that middle class, in a way, is aspiring for not just staying in the middle class, but perhaps a better life about that. But it's also the fact that it's a precarious place to be in economically, that they would listen and believe someone who comes forward and says, I will protect you from these people who will take what little you have, whether you're overseas workers in Qatar sending remittance money back to the Philippines, or you're Filipinos trying to earn a living every day, or middle-class people with a house to pay for, a car. You want to protect that. And Rodrigo Duterte comes in with the message that says, these are the people who commit crimes. They'll commit crimes against you. I will kill them for you. And they voted for him. Which also tells you that the justice system in the Philippines has failed. And that's how someone who claimed to be a prosecutor is able to convince people that prosecutions and justice in the Philippines doesn't work. Murder works better. Unfortunately, he was able to carry it out, but now he's facing justice, and hopefully it doesn't stop with an ICC prosecution. Hopefully it will also lead to truth-seeking in the Philippines. Hopefully it will also lead to reparations for the victims of his drug war in the Philippines.
You worked with many of the families impacted by the drug war. Tell me about them.
There's a particular mother who's been corresponding with me from time to time on social media, in messages. She had a son who was shot, body left on the street for the neighborhood to see, labeled as a drug addict. And one of the most fascinating and, in a way, better stories that have come out of that tragedy of her son having been murdered in the drug war is that she became an activist. This was just an ordinary mother trying to survive in a very poor neighborhood in Manila. But the injustice she suffered convinced her that there were other mothers and other fathers and other families who needed the kind of encouragement that she got from people who supported her search for justice. Local priests that I also met, forensic anthropologists that helped with autopsies that the government did not carry out properly, lawyers who supported preparation of statements that would go to the Commission on Human Rights and eventually used at the ICC. And there were many other families. Some of them I met in person, some of them I met in terms of the documents that I saw. And I think that it's important to remember that these families were mostly poor. These families were mostly apolitical. They were not part of organizations. They were trying to survive, and whether or not the family members who were killed or who survived, very few of them did, were ever involved in drugs or not at all, the fact is that none of them were ever arrested, prosecuted, found guilty, and punished. There's no capital punishment in the Philippines, and yet they were murdered. And so they deserve justice in all its forms, and perhaps that includes punishment, but that also means there are other forms of justice that they should be given.
You spent years documenting the consequences of this war, the consequences of the policies that Duterte enacted, but you spent years before that going after Ferdinand Marcos, the Marcos family. What are the consequences of the kind of work that you do in the Philippines?
Some of it moves things forward in a way that you can build on them. For example, having pursued the ill-gotten wealth of the Marcos family, recovered more than $600 million from their Swiss bank accounts, one of the things I did was to propose a bill for the Philippine Congress to pass, in which $200 million out of that 680 million would be set aside to pay reparations for families and victims of the Marcos dictatorship. So you are able to build upon what you accomplish, recover money, and you're able to propose reparations. And from that reparations, there's also a separate amount of money that was set aside to build a memorial to remember what happened during the dictatorship. So these things take time. And while I can tell you about that in 2 minutes, it took 10, 15 years for these things to happen. The arc of justice is long, and whether or not it bends in a way that it leads to justice is, I think, something that generations often wait for. And so it will possibly be the same in the Duterte case for the drug war killings. We see the ICC moving forward, but we also see that there's delay, that there's the uncertainty about the outcome. And I think that's what we do. We try to build on what has happened so far to make it more possible for justice to happen in the future.
So let's talk about their son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos. He is now president of the Philippines. And his cousin was the former Speaker of the House. The Marcos family has its imprint on the politics of this country, and they are facing off against the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, Sara Duterte. How is it that just decades after the end of the reign of Ferdinand Marcos, his son is back in power and his family is back in power?
Well, it's a combination of both old and new factors. The old factor, obviously, is that even with the overthrow of the Marcos dictatorship, the Philippines did not overthrow political dynasties. They existed before the dictatorship. They still existed after the dictatorship. But there are also new factors, and one of them is social media. One of them is technology and the uneven distribution of access to information, access to the internet. In a country that is still very poor, like the Philippines, access to the internet is uneven. People pay to have data, and so they try to use that data sparingly. And when a family that has amassed ill-gotten wealth between $5 to $10 billion, we only recovered about 5 billion of that from the Marcos family. They still have a lot of ill-gotten wealth left. That's a lot of money to pay for this information. That's enough money to run a campaign based on lies, and that money was able to bring back the Marcoses to power, of course, with the help of Rodrigo Duterte. And that's the other lesson, that political dynasties help each other. They might compete, they might become allies, but at the end of the day, they try to survive together. There's mutual aid among political dynasties in the Philippines. And for
But
us,
why do people vote for them?
people vote for them because despite all the rhetoric about modernization, whether it's economic or in the political culture, it's still a very feudal society politically. There is still patronage going on. And whether it's from the presidency all the way down to a village chief, you have loyalties that sometimes outlast generations. Children being groomed to be the next mayor or president or senator. And that ends up perpetuating both the dynasty and the culture of supporting them. One way to break that would be to give people both the opportunity to be economically less dependent on patronage. Another way to break that would be to allow people access to information, whether it's from the internet or whether it's actual education, college and universities. And if you combine that, you might be able to develop citizens with enough notions of their own freedom and their own economic autonomy to take their own destinies and decide for themselves.
There are many critics of the ICC, many people that say that it's an ineffective tool for international justice, that it is a court that has only really gone after African leaders. Is this case and the possible trial of Duterte proof that not only are those critics wrong, but that holding world leaders accountable is possible in this day and age?
Well, the criticism that the ICC has targeted and focused mainly on Arab and African individuals is partly true in the sense that if you looked at the cases that have actually gone to trial at the ICC where warrants have been issued, for example, you have about 33 individuals, except for Rodrigo Duterte, who's been arrested and detained. There are no other non-African, non-Arab individuals at the ICC. Of course, you have Vladimir Putin with a warrant of arrest issued against him. You have Benjamin Netanyahu with a warrant of arrest. You have Gallant, his defense minister, with a warrant of arrest. But those warrants have not been served, have not been enforced. So what you have are people who are either detained or charged, and all of them except Rodrigo Duterte are Arabs or Africans. On the other hand, many of those cases were referred by the countries and ruling governments of the people now charged, including Rodrigo Duterte in a sense, because he was surrendered to the ICC by his former ally and now rival Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And so it's not the ICC's fault that Africans and Arabs are in the court because they were brought there either by their own governments or by, for example, the UN Security Council, dominated by Western powers who are only too willing to use the UN Security Council for their own political agenda. That's how the Gaddafi case, for instance, ended up in the ICC. So it's not a straightforward characterization that the ICC is a colonial court that only serves the interests of the global north, but neither is it true that the ICC serves the interests of the global south, because the enforceability of warrants, for example, against Benjamin Netanyahu is an open question. It took them a while, the prosecutor of the ICC, to finally open the case involving Palestine. It took a genocide for that case to finally move forward for warrants to be issued against Israeli leaders. And so that's a valid criticism in that sense.
And yet, the consequence of those warrants being issued is the ICC is now under sanctions by the United States. Not only the ICC itself, but the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, the deputy prosecutors, and several of the judges. Is this still an effective tool to seek international justice, to hold leaders accountable, or is this the wrong place to look for that kind of justice?
One way to look at it is to follow that old adage about knowing who your enemies are, and so you can tell how successful you might be in doing what you have to do. And the fact that it's the US government, and the fact that it's really the US government supporting Israel in this situation that's trying to sanction the court might be an indicator of the court finally being able to do what it is supposed to do. On the other hand, it also creates an existential problem for the court because it relies on the most powerful countries in the world to enforce its warrants, or at least to be able to assert its jurisdiction in many of its cases. I think the court is in a very difficult balancing situation. Obviously, it has to serve its primary mandate to deal with cases that come before it, regardless of which country or which powerful government it might hurt. But on the other hand, we also need a court that survives. We also need a court that is able to function with in all the other cases that it's supposed to deal with: Myanmar, Afghanistan, um, Sudan, the Philippines. I think what's important right now is for the countries that actually are able to exert both political pressure and provide financial resources to openly and clearly state their support for the ICC. Many of them are in the European Union, the United Kingdom as well, Australia, Japan. These are all members of the ICC. Um, Several other African and Latin American states are, and I think it's important for these countries, middle powers, um, regional blocs, key countries in regions of the world to show up and stand for the ICC.
The court itself is less than 30 years old. It's a Gen Z, if you like. Do you think the ICC is facing an existential threat?
It is, and also it isn't. The same things were said about the UN as an institution many years ago. And I think that whether it's international governmental institutions or an international justice institution like the ICC, they cannot exist in a vacuum. They exist in a multipolar world where, in the absence of multilateral institutions that function independently of the greater powers that control these institutions, they are caught in that. Um, my hope is that voices that can articulate a workable compromise of sorts come forward as well, not just countries, and are able to navigate uh, this situation facing the ICC. And like I said, many of these will have to be countries outside of the United States, perhaps outside of countries like China and Russia in the Security Council, and express their support for the court so that the court can do what it has to do.
Your center is based in New York. US President Donald Trump has waged a war on drugs. He has deported migrants en masse. He has a contentious relationship with the media, to put it that way. I wonder, when you're talking about parallels with the Filipino experience, what do you see with what's happening right now in the US?
Having grown up under a dictatorship, of course, it concerns me when some of the basic features of authoritarian rule are emerging, whether it's the suppression of protest or essentially dictating what can be reported on in the news or the targeting of people. Um, I'm concerned that not only will authoritarian practices be replicated, but that they'll be normalized. And this normalization is, in a way, worse than dictatorships. We've always thought that dictatorships are an aberration, that they were not going to last because people overthrow them. But then we see elections leading to dictatorship. We see dictatorship behavior being normalized. And I think that's a cause for concern.
But the idea of democracy that you mentioned, is it still our best fighting chance to keep authoritarianism at bay? I mean, Duterte, with all of the criticisms that you have against him, was voted in and he was voted out. So do we still put our hope in democracy?
I think that we also need to see what we mean by democracy, whether it's political democracy, whether we only mean people having the right to vote, each person, one vote, or are we also talking about democratizing how people participate in elections, for example? Um, One of the, I think, telling experiences is Chile, where for a long time, even after the end of the Pinochet dictatorship, they operated under the Pinochet constitution. And I think there was a realization that this constitution was constricting democracy because it prevented new governments, progressive leaders, from carrying out economic reforms and social policies that would democratize access to public services, that would distribute wealth in a way that was also democratic, but the Constitution prevented that. And they did try to change that Constitution. They failed at first, and then they tried again. And I think that the Chilean post-Pinochet experience is a lesson. It's a lesson that you can't just overthrow dictators without overthrowing the framework of democracy, political democracy, their constitution that they operated in. And so I think it's important to revisit the idea that democracy is just about elections. I think it's important to consider whether redistribution of access to social services and economic opportunities, in fact, must be the foundation for political democracy to succeed.
Finally, Ruben, you see around the world many instances of rising political anger and low levels of trust in public institutions and the frameworks that govern our world. And we have been watching the genocide in Gaza for the last 2 years and the failure of Western leaders to bring it to an end. You are a believer in transitional justice. What can transitional justice offer a world like the one that we have right now?
I think transitional justice offers a very broad view of not just justice for what has happened, but change for what should happen. In Bangladesh and earlier in Sri Lanka, and we've seen this as well in Kenya, Indonesia, and more recently Nepal, we've seen younger generations protesting, being involved in uprisings. And that reminds me of a decade ago during the Arab Spring, where you had the same younger generations with the same grievances that we see now: unemployment, corruption, political repression, rising in the Middle East and North Africa, overthrowing dictatorships, only to be met with unfulfilled promises of change. And I think it's important for transitional justice to learn lessons from the Arab Spring and what should have been done after the Arab Spring, so that the frustrations of those who were able to overthrow the government in Nepal, change the government in Bangladesh, elect more progressive leadership in Sri Lanka, that their expectations can be substantially met. That this isn't just about removing a government, but this is about addressing questions of social and economic rights, employment, healthcare, education, dignity.
Ruben Carranza, thank you for joining us on Center Stage.
Thank you for having me.